One of the leading occult philosophers of all time was a man named Manly P. Hall. And in his classic book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, he said that you can trace the history and the presence of the occult organizations throughout history by simply looking at pictures or looking at books or looking at woodcuts or looking at architecture, because they use logos, they use symbols. Their presence is very obvious to those within the inside. But tragically, most people, the average individual, has no knowledge of the presence of these dark and sinister spiritual forces. Now, I want to convince you of three things. The first is that an understanding of the forces that have shaped the events of the 20th century is predicated not upon facts to be learned, but rather upon secrets to be discovered. The second is that men and women become accomplices to those evils they fail to oppose. And third, that the price that men and women pay for their apathy and indifference to public affairs is they are ruled by evil men. And I'd like to suggest today that we truly are ruled by evil men. Now, you'll be able to better understand the background of the history I'm about to tell you by reviewing three poems. The first was written by Albert Lord Tennyson in 1842. The second was written by Rudyard Kipling in 1902. And the third poem was written by James Russell Lowell in the 1840s or 1850s. Now, the first two poems and their significance are known to those people who work behind the scenes, but not to the average individual. When we talk about Tennyson, most people remember his wonderful poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. Cannons to the right of them, cannons to the left of them, cannons before them volleyed and thundered, stormed by shot and shell, bravely they rode and well. Into the jaws of death, into the gates of hell, rode the 600. But the poem that shaped the events of the 20th century was called Locksley Hall. Now, in my Encyclopedia Americana, they have a full page about a poem nobody ever heard of. But believe me, the people on the inside, those people who understand the unfolding of world events and are making them happen, understand the significance of this poem. And this is what Lord Tennyson wrote, what Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote. For I dipped into the future, far as any eye could see, saw a vision of the world and all the wonders that would be, heard the heavens filled with shouting and there rained a ghastly dew of the nation's airy navies grappling in the central blue, till the war drum throbbed no longer and the battle flags were furled in the Parliament of Man, the Federation of the World. And that's what it was about. This idea of the Parliament of Man, the Federation of the World, the establishment of a world government. Now, the ideas that Tennyson put forward in this poem captured the imagination of subsequent generations of people. One of them, of course, was a professor who would be teaching at Oxford University in 1870. His name was Professor John Ruskin. And, of course, this professor was a disciple of Plato, an avowed communist and socialist, and he thought this was a wonderful idea, and he passed this information on to many of his students. Students then were shaped the events that would occur in the early part of this century. Another man was a gentleman named Edward Bellamy. And Edward Bellamy wrote a book that was published in 1888 entitled Looking Backward. Now, this was a fascinating book because it was no sooner published than Bellamy clubs sprang up all over Great Britain and all over the United States, pushing the socialist utopia that he described. And basically, this is a story of an Englishman who fell asleep in 1888, I guess it was, and slept until the year 2000. He took a sedative. It was very effective. He woke up in the year 2000, and he described what the world would be like in that world that we are approaching, and approaching very, very rapidly. And he commented at that time that an American credit card will be just as good in Europe as gold once was. Now, remember, this was written 111 years ago today. At the present time, 111 years ago, Bellamy knew what the future held. Could you imagine people, even at the turn of the century or in the 50s, saying an American credit card will be just as good in Europe as gold once was? He described what had happened is that the corporations kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the corporations began absorbing other corporations until there was just a great trust that ruled everything. The great trust and government, the great corporation and the government controlled everything and provided for every person from the cradle to the grave, and everybody was just so very, very happy. A wonderful utopian view of history. And of course, what Edward Bellamy wrote is, "For I dipped into the future far as any eye could see, saw a vision of the world and all the wonder there would be, till the war drum throbbed no longer and the battle flags were furled in the Parliament of Man and the Federation of the World." It was just 5 years after Bellamy wrote that when Andrew Carnegie published his book, Triumphant Democracy. Now, those of you who are victims of a liberal education, as I was, probably look upon Andrew Carnegie as a robber baron. But actually, he took the vast fortune that he'd accumulated when he sold U.S. Steel to J.P. Morgan, and he invested that in foundations and endowments which were to bear his name, to convert America from a free into a socialist society. And so there won't be any question when we talk about socialism. Socialism is a sincere, benevolent, idealistic concept by which the government provides for everybody, from each according to their ability to each according to their need, and regulates the lives of people. But in truth, socialism has to have force. Somebody's got to be in charge. And what happens is you replace a free society with a feudal society because everybody is controlled by government. The government is controlled by politicians. Politicians are sold by those of great wealth. And you move from a society that evolved from England under the Magna Carta to these ideas of individual liberty, and then were suddenly dramatically changed. They became America, this dream of people being free under God. We destroy that concept and we supplant it with this idea of an all-powerful government that regulates people from the cradle to the grave. And so it was that Andrew Carnegie, in his book, Triumphant Democracy, wrote, and just look at the part that's underlined, where he says, "The Parliament of Man and the Federation of the World have already been hailed by the poet, but these mean a step much further in advance of the proposed reunion of Britain and America."